Today on Walk with History, the arm of Stonewall Jackson here in Virginia. To give you a sense of everything, Battle of Chancellorsville happens, we said May 2nd to May 6th, 1863. Right over here is where Stonewall Jackson is injured. Then right over here is where Stonewall Jackson's arm is amputated. Here is Ellwood House, where the arm is buried. And then this is where they take Jackson as he's sick and injured to the house here behind me, where Stonewall Jackson dies. Is Ellwood House. And this is the house of Reverend Beverly Tucker Lacey, who took the arm after it was amputated from Stonewall Jackson because he had visited the hospital the morning after his arm was amputated. And as he was leaving Jackson's tent, he saw the arm laying outside. He gathered up the limb, carried across the field to his brother's estate, Ellwood, and buried it here in the family cemetery. In 1903, this marker was erected by a Reverend James Power Smith. And Smith had been on Jackson's staff during the Civil War and later married Agnes Lacey, the daughter of Ellwood's owner. So this is the arm in the Jones family cemetery of Stonewall Jackson. First day of battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville, was May 2nd. That night, Jackson's riding for reconnaissance along his own friendly line, but he's looking to see where the Union is, where the rebels are, and members of the North Carolina infantry shoot him in the arm 3 times. And so that night, after midnight, his arm is amputated on May 3rd, 1863. Arm of Stonewall Jackson, May 3rd, 1863. Now remember, he's shot May 2nd, late at night, and then his arm is amputated on May 3rd. Stonewall Jackson is going to pass away right after this, about 9 days later from pneumonia. And then he's buried in Lexington, Virginia. And his wife is asked, would you like us to dig up the arm so he can be buried all together? But she had heard that his arm received a Christian funeral. And when she heard that, she said, best not to disturb a Christian burial. The Battle of Chancellorsville that rages on in Virginia from May 2nd to May 6th is a loss for the Union. General Joseph Hooker fails to give a victory to the Union side, and the Confederates actually win. But it's not a cheerful victory for the South, as it is the demise of Stonewall Jackson. So what's the impact of losing Stonewall Jackson? What is felt by the South after Stonewall Jackson dies? Revered like General Lee, Jackson had been a rallying force for the South. He had been, especially during some major battles, and his Stonewall Brigade earned him the nickname Stonewall Jackson. That comes from the Civil War. So that first Battle of Beer Run with the Stonewall Brigade, they earned that name. As Jackson's attempting to recover, General Lee sends correspondence stating that Stonewall has lost his left arm, but I had lost my right. And I think Robert E. Lee really felt that way. He knew losing this general is going to be the downfall of the South. His death brought deep sadness to the South. His death was a turning point in the war. In just a few months, the Union began to win integral battles, and that might not have happened if Jackson had been on the front lines. where the Levy, Reverend Levy's brother lived, where they buried the arm of Stonewall Jackson. And the house is directly behind me here. Make no mistake, this is a plantation. Enslaved worked this land, and this was a plantation deep in Virginia, deep in the South during the Civil War. Stonewall Jackson is revered by this family, which is why they saved his arm, which is why they bury it in their cemetery. They believe such an important man's arm shouldn't even be buried with all the amputated limbs from that battle in one mass grave. It deserves its own burial, and so they put it in their family cemetery here at Ellwood House. What's interesting about Ellwood House is during the Battle of Wilderness, the Union 5th Troops Commander Warren from Gettysburg occupied the first room on the left of the front door during the battle. And here on May 5th, he received reports of staggering casualties from his chief surgeon. And that was just, the bloodshed was just beginning. The Battle of Wilderness is really raging on right around here. And like I said, General Grant and Army Commander Meade will visit Ellwood on the afternoon of May 5th, 1864. Stonewall Jackson's arm is already in the cemetery. They probably don't even know it's here, which is very interesting. You have Grant and Meade coming to visit Warren here as the headquarters for the Battle of Wilderness in 1864. Unbeknownst to them, Stonewall Jackson's arm is right in the family cemetery. Isn't that crazy? The arm actually laid here for 40 years in obscurity. This marker wasn't here. This marker is not put up until the early 1900s. And so James Smith, one of Stonewall's former staff officers and apparently expert on the arm, was taken to the cemetery and asked to direct the placement of the tombstone. Unfortunately, when they dug to find the arm here, they haven't found it, but they do still believe the arm is here. There is accounts of Union soldiers coming here, digging up the arm, but reburying the arm. They do believe it is in the cemetery, even if it's not exactly marked where this marker is. The National Park Service here will not disturb the limb. They're not going to dig, and people come from all over to visit this famous limb. Right along Plank Road outside of Chancellorsville. And this is close to the location where Stonewall Jackson was wounded, where his arm was shot 3 times and was wounded by friendly fire about 9:30 p.m. on the 2nd of May, 1863. Having brilliantly executed a flanking maneuver against the Federals. So you can see this is kind of on one side or another. But Jackson, with 8 aides, was returning from reconnaissance between the lines when skirmishing erupted, and they were mistaken for Federals in the darkness. Fired on by the 18th North Carolina Infantry, killing 4 and wounding Jackson. So they didn't only just wound Jackson, they killed 4 people. Friendly fire. They killed 4 of their own guys and wounded Jackson. After the battlefield amputation of his left arm, he was taken 17 miles southeast to Guinea Station, where he died on May 10th from infection. Tent here. It wasn't even a building. This is where Stonewall Jackson's arm was amputated, right in this area. So Dr. Hunter McGuire, we had been to his grave at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, amputated his arm in the early hours of May 3rd, 1863. So as you remember, he's injured 9:30 p.m., May 2nd. They get him here. His arm has been shot twice, pretty much shattered, and they amputate his arm here. Left arm at a field hospital 3 miles west of the battlefield, near Wilderness Tavern. This is close enough to where he's shot and the 4 other men are dead that they bring him here Then his arm is amputated here, and then the arm is taken to Ellwood Farm, and then he is moved on, and he will die 7 days later. Dies here May 10th, 1863. This is the Fairfield Plantation. So right behind me is the room where Stonewall Jackson actually died. Stonewall Jackson wanted to stay here. They had camped, his corps had camped around here. And on May 4th, 1863, 2 days after being wounded in Chancellorsville, Jackson was brought to the Fairfield office to recuperate, and he died here 6 days later. Like I said, this was an outbuilding, like an office. You see the house was here. So that's where the house, it says the house site, and it's kind of squared off. And then this was like an office building, an outbuilding, a storeroom. And Jackson's wife, Mary Ann, and their infant daughter, Julia, arrived on May 7th, so 3 days before he dies. The same day that the pneumonia set in. So you can imagine he's already weak, lost his arm, and now he has pneumonia. Miss Jackson had last seen her husband on April 29th in full flush and vigorous manhood. Now she wrote, his fearful wounds, his mutilated arm, the scratches upon his face, and above all, the desperate pneumonia, which was flushing his cheeks, oppressed his breathing and bemumbling his senses. On May 10th, she asked her husband if he was willing to die that day, if such was God's will. The general whispered, I prefer it. So he was slipping in and out of delirium towards the end of his life, and he shouted commands as if he was in battle. And he ordered A.P. Hill to prep for action, pass the infantry to the front rapidly. Tell Major Hawks, his voice went silent. Then he smiled, a smile of sweetness. Quietly he said, let's cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. Those were his last words. I hope you enjoyed this walk with history. I hope you learned something about Stonewall Jackson. I hope you realize now all the impact that was the turning point of the Civil War that caused the South to have deficits in a way that would make the Union capitalize and win. And on to my next walk with history.